The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm splitting my time with the member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, who will be sharing my time. And I want to thank the official opposition Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs, the member for Brantford, Brant, for his motion today. And it is disappointing that I even have to rise in this place today to have to speak to this despicable situation that the government has put themselves in, that it is so disappointing that when the Minister of Veterans Affairs found out that a convicted murderer, Chris Garnier, who is not a veteran, is receiving benefits under Veterans Affairs Canada for PTSD that he's experienced because he killed police officer Catherine Campbell, and that is a benefit that he should never be entitled to for his heinous crimes. Now, I got to say that you got to remember that this individual, Christopher Garnier, picked up, Catherine Campbell off duty, took her back to his apartment, broke her nose, strangled her, and desecrated her body by treating it like garbage and dumped it underneath the McDonald Bridge in Halifax. Catherine Campbell was not just an outstanding police officer, she was a volunteer firefighter, and I extend my condolences to her family. I hope that, that this whole situation, they haven't been re-victimized by the actions of Veterans Affairs by extending benefits to the killer of their daughter, benefits that they are not entitled to. And that, to me, is very disgusting. This whole thing, this whole debate today is disgusting. It's disgusting because of this vicious act of murder by Garnier. I'm disgusted by a policy decision that may have been made erroneously by Veterans Affairs Canada. I'm disgusted by the shameful behavior of the Minister of Veterans Affairs. He gets in here every day and is full of pompous bravado, pounds his chest and rails against the opposition, but refuses to do anything to help our veterans and is allowing this murderer to actually go ahead of veterans in the line to get services for things like PTSD. That is a lack of leadership, and I am also disgusted by that. I think all veterans, people that are contacting us as members of Parliament, all veterans are disgusted by the behavior of this government and this failure of leadership by the Prime Minister not to intercede here, to correct the behavior of the Minister of Veterans Affairs and make sure that these services are being rescinded. Let's look at the facts, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at the facts because we're hearing all sorts of rhetoric coming from the Liberal benches. Christopher Garnier is not a vet. He's 30 years old and has never put on the uniform, and there is no way that he is entitled to any benefits under Veterans Affairs. Now, Liberals are claiming privacy because of the father, who was a veteran, but let's be clear that these types of services are allowed to the dependent children and spouses of our veterans, and they're still waiting in line while this non-dependent adult of 30 years of age is getting the benefits that other families should actually be receiving right now to deal with PTSD and operational stress injuries of their loved ones. Fact is, if you looked at the court case, as well as what was been reported in the media, Chris Garnier's father, Chris Garnier's lawyer, Chris Garnier's psychologist, all admitted in court and to the press that Chris Garnier's PTSD is a direct result of him murdering Catherine Campbell. His PTSD is guilt and remorse for the vicious attack and the way he desecrated the body of his victim. That should never, ever qualify for a Veterans Affairs benefit. You need to keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, that Corrections Services Canada offers mental health and counseling to all those that are incarcerated. There is no reason why Veterans Affairs Canada should ever feel that they need to provide service to anyone that is incarcerated. They have every opportunity to provide those services through other government agencies. And Correction Services Canada has those services readily available to convicts right across this country. You know, we heard during question period, while we were hammering away at the Minister of Veterans Affairs for his ridiculous answers and his shameful behavior and his disrespect towards veterans and especially the family of Catherine Campbell, that they were going to rescind this policy. But yet, if you actually look at the details of what was announced, they're trying to provide cover to the minister who still refuses to rescind these benefits to Christopher Garnier. You know, throughout question period, Mr. Speaker, we heard the minister hide behind privacy, and we heard the Minister of Veterans Affairs say over and over again that he is going to stand by our veterans. Well, first of all, again, I must say, Christopher Garnier is not a veteran. He should never receive veterans benefits. No adult child of a veteran gets any benefits from Veterans Affairs Canada. If he is so convinced that he needs to stand by our veterans, what would he do in the case of former Colonel Russell Williams, who was a serial killer? When we were in government and we found that out, we rescinded all his veterans benefits, his veterans pensions, because this individual should not be entitled to any of it as an incarcerated serial killer. So how can the minister today stand in this place and says that he'll stand by any veteran despite any heinous crime that they commit, when the precedent was set by our former Conservative government that we would not provide benefits to someone like Russell Williams, a former colonel in the Air Force? He talks about that he's going to stand by our veterans. Well, Sean Brueus is suing that minister for defamation of character. That's how this minister acts. And when you think about it, he stands by our veterans. Well, he stands by everybody, but look how he's treating Admiral Mark Norman. It's this government that is taking him to court for something that he never did. Now, you know, we keep hearing from the Liberal benches, and we hear from the member from Winnipeg Centre and Winnipeg North get up here and talk about all the things that they're doing. Well, let's look at the real metrics of what the Liberals have done for veterans. Wait times underneath the Liberals have gone up from 16 weeks to actually 7 months. Veterans are waiting longer to get the benefits that they're entitled to, Mr. Speaker, under that Liberal government. We just saw announced just this past week that veterans now are going to be denied service dogs for PTSD, despite all the research showing a significant reduction in PTSD symptoms in our veterans. And what is Veterans Affairs doing under this minister? Well, they're going to take away that program, that great program where we actually see animal husbandry and animal companionship with our veterans reduces the impact of PTSD and other operational stress injuries, Mr. Speaker. And this minister, even though the Prime Minister promised that he would not take veterans back to court, it was this minister that actually beat veterans in court with the Equitas lawsuit. Great track record we have here. Of course, they cut $372 million over their tenure in their 3 years of veterans benefits. Lapse funding. So I guess when the Prime Minister stood in Edmonton and told a veteran right to his face in a town hall meeting that you're asking for more than we can give, well, Mr. Speaker, it truly proves a point that they had the money, they just don't want to spend the money on our veterans. And you talk about their benefits program, well, it's just a shell game. It's no life pension for life. It's just a shell game. It's a bunch of programs that they put together and tried to reinvent the wheel. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing, I say this. If there's any members on that Liberal bench who want to stand for our veterans rather than to stand for their Minister of Veterans Affairs, to stand tonight and vote yes for this motion and ensure that we stop and rescind all the policies and programs that are being offered to Christopher Garnier.
Question Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had a number of roundtables with veterans from my riding of Oakville about 3 years ago, asking how things were with them, were they able to access services, and I heard uniformly that they were having difficulty accessing services, and I heard from a mother whose son had served and was a veteran suffering from PTSD and the concerns she had about adequate support and adequate treatment for them. So that's why I'm so glad to see that our government has been reinvesting in veterans, opened the new Centre of Excellence for Post-Traumatic Stress Order, and launched a joint suicide prevention strategy along with the Canadian Armed Forces. So my question to the member is, where was he? Where was he during the 10 years when the Conservatives lost the trust of the veterans community? Where was he when it came to improving mental health services? And where was he when the Auditor General said they were not doing enough to facilitate veterans' timely access to mental health services and benefits? Where was he during that decade?
For Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I should remind the member that I used to be the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence, and I went across this country and met with ill and injured. I actually opened the Centre of Excellence at the Ottawa Mental Health Centre that helped support our troops and our veterans in actually moving ahead on dealing with PTSD and operational stress injuries. And where's that member? He said he met with them 3 years ago. Why hasn't he met with them in the last 3 years? Because if you went and met with veterans groups today, as I am, they are disgusted by this government and the way they are using veterans as props rather than actually delivering services. And all you have to do is look at the metrics I put out there already. $372 million of lapsed funding through Veterans Affairs, and wait times for veterans have gone from 16 weeks, which is the mark, up to 7 months under this Liberal government. That is shameful.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I have a lot of respect for my colleague who has been presenting in the House. We sit on the Defence Committee together, and from time to time we actually see eye to eye. But I regret that this is not one of those issues, Mr. Speaker. The reality of the situation is that he's been trying to characterize the former government, the former Conservative government, as you know, friends of vets, when in reality that wasn't the case, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at some of the facts. Killing lifetime pensions for veterans, closing 9 Veterans Affairs offices, having to force a court to instruct the former Conservative government to pay back $887 million to veterans. How can he possibly claim that the former Conservative government was doing great things for veterans when the record shows completely otherwise?
Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
My friend from Kingston and the Islands shouldn't throw stones in glass houses. I tell you, Mr. Speaker, if you actually look at the facts, when you see them talk about opening up offices, but they actually have extended the wait times, that veterans are waiting for services up to 7 months. That isn't performance. He talks about money not spent, $372 million of lapsed funding under the Liberals. You know, people need to actually look at doing things for our veterans. That's why I was so happy in our National Policy Convention that we had just in Halifax this summer, that we brought forward a new policy called Duty of Care, and says that the Conservative Party Canada recognizes and accepts unreservedly the existence of a social covenant between the Government of Canada and those who have served in the Canadian Armed Forces, the Military Covenant. We're going to honour that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to make sure that, you know, even though he talks about ending lifetime pensions, you've got to remember that happened under the Paul Martin government when they brought forward the new Veterans Charter. And again, he needs to get his facts straight.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his impassioned speech. You know, in my riding of North Island, Powell River, I have numerous veterans that I work with frequently. I can think of one right now who has a service dog that really helps him with his post-traumatic stress, and he can't find housing because they don't take dogs. So I think when you look at the gaps of services, and I really think we need to commend the people like the Comox Military Family Resource Centre in my riding that work day in and day out with these veterans. I just want to ask the member if he could talk about what it really means for veterans on the ground when over $300 million is left on the table when there are services and needs that veterans have today. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my friend from North Powell River, North Vancouver Island and Powell River. Beautiful riding. I've had the opportunity to be out to 19 Wing a couple of times and met with the Military Family Resource Center there, along with the JPSU and the Integrated Personnel Support Service Center. They do great work. And to know that there's money on the table that isn't getting used for things like PTSD service dogs for those veterans that need those services is really disappointing. When all the research shows, both Canadian and American research, that those service dogs do a great job. So the more that we can do to support those veterans, like in her riding, the better off we're going to be as a nation, and the more better off we're going to be in finding people that want to serve in uniform, knowing that they will be properly cared for by having in place a military covenant.
Resume.